Hi, this is Amanda Loggins with my presentation on legalization of cannabis for Aspen University, Class 655, Neurobiology of Addiction. Before we can delve into the pros and cons of legalizing marijuana, it's first important to learn some facts about cannabis. Cannabis is not new to the medical or recreational scene. It is in fact has been documented for use as far back as 12,000 years ago, which makes it one of the earliest cultivated crops. The earliest use of recorded medical use of marijuana dates back to 4000 BC in China, where the plant was used as an anesthetic during surgery. China is also the country that lays claim to the origination location of cannabis. By 1000 BC, cannabis had moved into India to help alleviate anxiety. By the medieval times, cannabis had entered Germany and Europe to be used for toothaches and to assist with the pain of childbirth. Up until the early 1900s, cannabis was considered a useful drug and was used in numerous treatment plans. In 1937 is when Congress passed the Marijuana Tax Act, which marked the beginning of federal marijuana prohibition. It was not prohibited due to public health concern. However, it was prohibited due to racial prejudice against an influx of immigrants from Mexico who were using cannabis. 1971 marked the beginning of the war on drugs started by President Richard Nixon, placing cannabis in the strictest category of drugs. Not even a decade later, President Ronald Reagan escalated the war on drugs, leading to massive arrests and incarcerations for cannabis. It wasn't until 1996 when California became the first state to approve the use of cannabis for medical use once again. 2010 brought about the legislation of cannabis to the forefront of politics, making it a mainstream issue. In 2012, Colorado and Washington State became the first places worldwide to legally regulate cannabis. 1 year later, in 2013, Uruguay became the first nation to legally regulate cannabis. Back to the United States, with Oregon, Alaska, and Washington, D.C. to legalize cannabis, and New York became the 23rd state to approve the use for cannabis for medical use. The previous information on the cannabis timeline was supplied by the Drug Policy Alliance in a report released in 2014. To bring this information current, Business Insider has the report on the current states where recreational cannabis is legal. These states are as follows: Alaska, California, Colorado, Maine, Massachusetts, Nevada, Oregon, Washington, and Washington, D.C. According to Procon.org, the number of states that have enacted medical cannabis legalization stands at 29 states and Washington, D.C. During a January 2014 New Yorker interview, President Barack Obama admitted to smoking cannabis when he was young. He also stated, "I don't think it's more dangerous than alcohol." Here are a few quick facts about cannabis before we continue on to the pros and cons of legalization. Cannabis is the most common and most accessible illegal drug. Many people who have used cannabis have never gone on to use any other kind of drug or continued cannabis use for an extended period. Individuals who have continued onto drugs such as heroin, cocaine, and LSD likely first access cannabis mainly due to accessibility. Instead of being known as a gateway drug, cannabis is being used as an exit drug for some people. Individuals who have been given cannabis as a treatment in a way of reducing and even eliminating their use of opiates and other harmful drugs by easing the withdrawal symptoms. Becoming dependent on cannabis is a worry of those who oppose the legalization. Less than 10% of people who have ever tried cannabis ever meet the clinical criteria for dependence, whereas 32% of tobacco users and 15% of alcohol users do meet the clinical criteria. Cannabis can affect psychomotor and perceptual performance, but in driving studies it has been concluded that cannabis produces little to no driving impairment. It is when cannabis is paired with other substances where issues may arise. Also, with the criminalization associated with cannabis, there is not education material available like there is with driving while intoxicated with alcohol. According to the National Academy of Sciences, there is little evidence that decriminalization of marijuana use leads to substantial increase in marijuana use. In short, legal access to cannabis does not lead to an increased use of cannabis. By legalizing cannabis, it makes it boring and in turn people are not enticed to continue to use it. Crime data from the FBI in 2011 states that there were 1.5 million drug arrests nationwide, and of those, 49.5% were due to marijuana use. The Drug Policy Alliance is a strong supporter of having cannabis removed from the criminal justice system and regulation in the same regards to alcohol and tobacco. Having cannabis illegal harms young people of color, sponsors high levels of corruption and violence, and it fails to stop youth from using. By having cannabis a legal commodity, one of the largest cash crops in the nation would ultimately lead to job creation. The jobs created from this market would also lead to economic growth by moving this money from the illicit market into the formal economy. The move of cannabis from the illicit market to the mainstream market will open up a great deal of funds for each state and local governments through new tax revenue and regulated sales. The limited number of law enforcement resources would be able to be used on more serious crimes. Consumers of cannabis will also be more informed about the variety of cannabis they ingest because product testing is a standard requirement for current legalization marijuana markets. Never in recorded history has there been an instance of marijuana overdose. Even something as simple as drugstore aspirin has an overdose warning. Russ Lee Monkill, the 2012 Libertarian candidate for Congress in Missouri's 6th District, made a statement regarding the legalization of cannabis. There are a number of law enforcement that are a part of a nonprofit group called Law Enforcement Against Prohibition, LEAP. This group wants it to be known that loosening the policy on cannabis wouldn't condone drug use, but in fact control it, while assisting law enforcement to achieve their ultimate goal of increasing public safety. There are 5 main points that this group focuses on in regards to cannabis. The first key point is about growing and maintaining public safety. When the prohibition on alcohol ended, Al Capone was out of a job the very next day. According to Stephen Downing, Los Angeles' former deputy chief of police said, "Our drug policy is really anti-public safety and pro-cartel, pro-street gang, because it keeps them in business." The second key point is about how law enforcement wants to focus on more serious crimes. There's a lot of police time and resources that are wasted focusing on incidents that involve cannabis. Thirdly, law enforcement wants to strengthen their relationships with the communities they serve. By making cannabis legal, law enforcement would be able to increase the citizens' trust in police and make them more likely to communicate and help solve more serious crimes. Building the mutual respect between law enforcement and the community will protect law enforcement while they're on the job. The fourth point that is high on the list is that the war on pot encourages bad and even at times illegal police practices. The quotas that need to be met pressure the officers to make drug arrests in order to make a profit, receive federal funding along with asset forfeiture. These requirements encourage routine violations of the Fourth Amendment ban on unreasonable searches and seizures. Removing cannabis from illegal offenses will allow law enforcement to see young adults not as criminals, but instead as members of the community. The last point that this group makes is that they want to stop kids from abusing drugs. Education and treatment is the most effective and cost-effective way to reduce drug use, like we did with tobacco. When considering information pertaining to legalization of cannabis in the workplace, this brings about some important questions, some of which will need to thought out in length to determine the best possible route to take. In some states that have already legalized cannabis, they're continuing to follow OSHA standards for workplace safety. Dr. Robert Hartwig, president and economist with the Insurance Information Institute, said that as long as there is a federal statute that deems marijuana illegal, there will be no federal revision to workers' comp legislation. One question that has been posed in multiple locations is whether denying an employee the right to medical marijuana or even the use of marijuana recreationally where applicable, a violation of an employee's personal rights. The medical marijuana industry, as of a few years ago, has a profit of $1.5 billion annually, with around half of the 50 states who have legalized medical cannabis. One can only imagine the annual profit of the medical cannabis industry if all 50 states, Washington, D.C., and the American territories all legalize medical cannabis. The medical benefits of cannabis is undeniable. There have been many studies completed that have been published in highly respected medical journals as documentation. Cannabis has been shown to alleviate symptoms of debilitating medical conditions such as cancer, HIV/AIDS, multiple sclerosis, Alzheimer's disease, epilepsy, and Crohn's disease. It has been documented that cannabis is a much safer and more effective way of treating pain than with traditional narcotic painkillers. Nausea, appetite, glaucoma, and some neurological disorders are also aided with the help of cannabis. One health condition that is not necessarily thought about in mainstream medicine is mental health. Cannabis helps manage some of the mental health issues, particularly PTSD, which would be a great benefit to our military members. Dr. Rob Schaff is a physician and a Missouri State Senator for District 34. In his role as a doctor, if a medicine helps make a patient's life better, then it shouldn't be prohibited from being able to have it. He says, "I'm actually in favor of medical marijuana." As with other aspects of cannabis, it's related back to other substances. Smoking marijuana isn't good for you, but then neither is drinking a beer. This is where the option of cannabis edibles come into play. So you're going to legalize something for 100% of the population when less than 4% use it for the purpose for which you're legalizing it. That doesn't make any sense at all. Dwight Scroggins, Buchanan County Prosecuting Attorney. Dwight Scroggins, Buchanan County Prosecuting Attorney, questions why the government would legalize something that harms people that only a small share of people are using. Phil Wells, Chief Clinical and Compliance Officer with Tampa-based Pharmacy Benefits Manager Matrix Healthcare Services, said, 2 marijuana cigarettes are equal in toxicity to a pack of cigarettes. States are lining up to legalize something that is going to cause harm. Wall also believes marijuana is a gateway drug that paves the way for other illegal substances. He claims that people are not getting arrested and going to jail for cannabis possession alone, and in most circumstances, a person is only charged a small fee of $50 to $100. Pat Lilly, President and Chief Executive of the St. Joseph Metro Chamber, mentions that a concern of employers is that they won't be able to be competitive because they won't be able to get candidates to pass drug screenings. Some parts of society think that cannabis is one of the scourges of society. This part of society believes that marijuana not only leads to more crime, but that it affects individuals in a deeper way. They think that users suffer from mental and emotional disorders. Dwight Scroggins alleges to have research that has shown long-term lead to increased violence, and that next to alcohol there have been an increased number of traffic accidents. He also believes that it lowers IQ and brain development for young adults and teens. A quick recap of the pros and cons regarding the legalization of cannabis. In the pro column, cannabis was used for medical uses for many more years, we're talking centennials here, than it has been illegal. Prohibition wasn't due to the harm of society or individuals, instead of because of immigrants from Mexico using cannabis. It was a racial issue. There are members of law enforcement that are for legalization because they want to focus their efforts on more serious crimes. The medicinal uses of cannabis are undeniable, and they're backed up by studies published in highly respected medical journals. In the con column, we have people alleging that cannabis is far from safe and that it leads to all sorts of health and societal harms. There's an executive from a big pharma company that says 2 cannabis cigarettes are more toxic than a pack of tobacco cigarettes. There's also a claim that marijuana is a gateway drug to harder drugs that can do more damage to people in their lives. Also, every 45 seconds, someone is arrested for a cannabis-related incident. It isn't surprising that Big Pharma is against legalization of cannabis. If and when cannabis is legalized at the federal level, the big pharma companies will endure a massive hit to their profits. Every con that has been presented has a pro counterpart, and ultimately the pros end up outnumbering the cons. I think that it was interesting to learn that cannabis was only prohibited because of a racial issue and not an issue related with cannabis itself and its effects.